This is Lee Clegg, President of Africa Business Portal, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Today's webinar is the case for Africa as the U.S. top trade priority. Just a few housekeeping issues before we begin. The webinar will be available in an on-demand basis after 48 to 72 hours. You can expect an email with us, and it'll also have contact information on the participants. We'll be creating a landing page with the webinar information and additional information you may be interested in. And most question and answers will be done in writing. You can submit your questions or comments from the platform or email to Africa Business Portal at ian@africabsp.com. So happy to introduce today's speakers. The first is Melissa Sanderson, Vice President of International Affairs for Freeport-McMoRan. She'll be discussing engaging district export councils and other resources in support of Africa trade. Philip Thiego is Director for Africa, Thunderbird School of Global Management. He'll be addressing digital access as a pathway to greater African trade and investment. Dr. Gabedo Oduluru is Senior Consultant with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and he'll be discussing the disastrous impacts of status quo in the U.S. economy. And our own Quintin Skulls, Vice President of Africa Business Portal, will be discussing a vision of economic change for U.S. and African SMEs. We're thrilled to have as our presenter Melissa Sanderson, the Vice President of International Affairs for Freeport-McMoRan, and she is also the Chair of the Phoenix Committee on Foreign Relations and Chair of the Arizona District Export Council. And she'll be discussing engaging district export councils and other resources in support of Africa trade. So we'll turn the time over to you, Melon. If you wouldn't mind taking just a moment to introduce your engagement in the past Africa.
Oh, absolutely. And thanks so much, Lee, for having me here today. As you know, I always enjoy sharing my passion for Africa. And I got that passion from living for 8 years in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which I consider to be my adopted second country. I went originally to the Congo as the political counselor for the U.S. Embassy when I was still with the American Diplomatic Service. And then realizing that I wanted to stay in the country and continue working for it, I was fortunate to be approached by an American mining company, Freeport-McMoRan, who was interested in opening a copper and cobalt mine in the country. And they wanted some in-country expertise, and I wanted to stay in the Congo, so it was a marriage made in heaven. And thanks to that marriage made in heaven, I wound up living another 5 years in the Congo. And while I was based in the Congo for both State Department and the company, I had the opportunity to visit several other African countries. So while I'm by no means an expert on the entire continent, I do have some expertise in selected countries, and I would say a pretty deep expertise for the DRC. So with that said, I will turn to the subject of today's conversation, which is a hidden gem of a resource, absolutely free resource, available to exporters nationwide. So beginning at the big picture level, the National District Export Council is the Washington-based headquarters, so to speak, of the state-based district export councils throughout the U.S. So the mission of the National District Export Council and the state district export councils is to support the growth of exports, particularly by small and medium enterprises, and thereby support job growth and economic prosperity. So we do this through outreach and engagement from the national decks to the deck and from the decks to state-based companies. Next slide, please. There we are. We are actual human beings available to help you. So we are a grouping of expert business persons with skills ranging from the financial sector, how to find financing for business growth or business startups, to complex questions like how to find an export broker, how to deal with export controls, how to respond to tariff decisions. All sorts of those things are included in our mandate. And we have approximately 1,500 DEC members throughout the United States. Every state has at least one district export councils. Some states like Texas have more than one, but that's Texas for you. Next slide, please. So the National District Export Council has, as you can see here on the screen, a series of objectives that we try to fulfill. The first and most important of which is mentoring local businesses in exporting. That's why it's important to know that we also are locally based business persons, and we have a personal interest in helping you. We also try to identify, as I remarked earlier, export financing. We have experts that work in those areas, try to create greater export awareness, and basically just try to advocate for trade policy. And this includes educating our politicians to support free and fair trade agreements that facilitate our ability as businesses to reach out globally. Next slide, please. So it would be fair to say that not everyone understands the importance of international trade, at least here in the United States. It's a little known but very true fact that more than 41 million American jobs depend on trade. That's a lot of people. And it's also true to say that 90% of U.S. companies that export are small and medium businesses. And the same is true overseas. That's why the matchmaking between small and medium exporters is so important, because it allows for mutual growth and mutual benefit. It's also true to say that over 90% of your growth potential is located outside of the United States. We are a global economy. There's no going back from that. And you cannot realize your full growth potential by only concentrating on the U.S. market. And that's why the DECs exist, working with the U.S. Department of Commerce to encourage you to consider the world. Next slide, please. The National District Export Council has 4 main priority issues that it's currently looking at, but I won't talk to those right now because I want to come back and discuss those in more detail. Next slide, please. This is an example from my state, since I'm based in Phoenix, Arizona, of the benefits that Arizona companies have realized thanks to the 20-year-old North American Free Trade Agreement. As you can see from this chart, graphic growth has taken place, and this includes the development of integrated cross-border supply chains from industries ranging from automotive to IT. That would be the case with Mexico, and equally true has been the flourishing of foreign direct investment by Canadian companies in the Arizona market. All of these sorts of opportunities, however, are made possible by free trade agreements. Let's go back to the previous slide for a second. You notice that the very first priority is passage of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, known as the USMCA. This is the successor agreement to NAFTA. It's been under negotiation for almost 2 years and is now before the U.S. Congress for ratification. As with any trade agreement, not everyone is 100% satisfied, but the USMCA represents major improvements in key areas, such as labor protections. Mexico recently passed, for example, legislation providing for new empowerment of Mexican labor unions, collective bargaining, and government intervention to protect the structure. This was a key element of the USMCA and a real step forward in being able to realize it. The Export-Import Bank being fully operational, this has now been achieved because just recently the Senate voted to fill all of the board positions on the bank board. Why does this matter? Being understaffed at the board level meant that Ex-Im loan limit was set at $10 million maximum. And this simply cut out a lot of funding for many companies. Now that the board seats are filled, the lending ceiling is lifted, and we are very hopeful that EXIM will soon be back in full operation supporting exporters, small and large. So recent tariffs. Well, we are living in the most complicated trade time that I've known in my lifetime. Yes, and tariffs complicate life for all of us. The president recently announced, for example, the imposition of additional tariffs on $200 billion of Chinese imports, on top of the existing import structure. We're also having issues with China in the IT domain, and that is an arena that can affect us all because of the nature of who makes the chips that are inside of the things that we all live with every day. So there's some troubling and difficult times with the tariffs, but there's also some good news because President Trump recently announced that he was lifting the tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, and this is key to getting to ratification of the USMCA, because both Mexico and Canada had indicated that they had no intention of ratifying the agreement if these tariffs remained in place. So that's a big win. Another potential win is in regards to the miscellaneous tariff bill, which had been stalled for several years in Congress and is finally beginning to move again, and is receiving broad-based support not only from the National District Export Council, but from other business organizations as well. So we're hopeful in that regard. And we see here that a huge priority for us is to push back against the administration's request for an enormous reduce in funding for the Department of Commerce, the commercial service. Why does this matter? It's not just because the Department of Commerce is the key partner of the District Export Council. It's because the Department of Commerce is the primary government agency charged with supporting and growing U.S. exports, attracting foreign direct investment, which means growing U.S. jobs, and facilitating imports necessary for American manufacturers to continue to thrive and grow. So you can easily see from that alone the importance of the commercial service. But let me also say that they are present in many embassies overseas, and they have access to foreign government officials. And as many of you already know, that sort of access is priceless, because when you're trying to set up a business overseas, you are going to be dealing with foreign governments. There's no way around it. And the Department of Commerce and the Department of State are your two best allies. So we're fighting hard against this short-sighted proposal to hollow out the commercial service. And we hope that Congress will see its way clear to restoring full funding. So I think I'm going to end there, Lee. If you have any questions, I'll be pleased to take them.
All right. We have one submitted, and it dealt with what is the impact of export regulations as it relates to agricultural products coming from Africa into the U.S.
Okay. That's a super question because there's so much growth potential in the agricultural arena. I mean, just a personal note, I love the avocados and papayas from the Congo. They're huge, they're luscious, they're organic, they're incredibly delicious. You can have one avocado and it's your whole breakfast. That's how big they are. So I would love to see more African produce entering the United States. And I do think that it's a time of opportunity. Check into recent decisions, for instance, regarding tomatoes. But I will also add that I am not an expert in the phytosanitary regulations. They're very complex. They vary not just continent to continent, but country to country. So rather than risk giving any sort of inaccurate or misleading information, what I will do, if you send a subsequent email with further details, I can refer that to one of our ag experts here on the Arizona District Export Council, try to get you a better and more accurate answer.
The second question is one I would like to ask you, Melissa. What is the impact of full engagement by the U.S. business community in Africa? What could happen?
Oh my gosh, I think it would be just a real game changer, a true gain for both Africa and the United States. Several areas of opportunity spring to mind. I mean, infrastructure is often discussed, but within physical infrastructure, I mean, there are so many opportunities, for instance, in IT and web-based banking. Africans in general are so far ahead of Americans in terms of using the phone for direct payments, for credit transfers, for all sorts of things. And the United States is dreadfully underrepresented in that arena, as well as in the arena of general infrastructure growth. I mean, yes, it's certainly true that China, particularly through the Belt and Road Initiative, has been very helpful for infrastructure development, particularly in rail lines. But I would also say that there's been some mixed results, not universally positive. And it's encouraging that African countries across the continent would still prefer American engagement. And I think that there's an opportunity from the American side, because the Trump administration has set up a new fund, the Build Fund. So that would be dedicated to helping U.S. companies get into the new markets in Africa and bringing that U.S. expertise, U.S. values, U.S. tech transfer, etc., to the continent. So I absolutely think it would be a huge win-win, and I'm optimistic that it can take place.
Thank you, Melissa. It's absolutely wonderful to have you as a presenter.
Thanks so much, Lee. I had a lot of fun. Hope you ask me again.
We'll do that. Thank you. We're now thrilled to be able to introduce you to Philip Thiego, Director for Africa, Thunderbird School of Global Management. And we're thrilled that Thunderbird is willing to join us today. And they have a huge global footprint and a major plan for Africa. And he'll be addressing digital access as a pathway to greater African trade and investment. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you so much, Clegg, for having me. As Clegg has mentioned, I'm the Director for Africa for the Thunderbird School of Global Management, and my topic today really is how do we understand digital access as a pathway to Africa's trade and investment. The things I think, as I often say, we take for granted in Africa is aspirations that form the people's consciousness, but also unconsciousness that should not be divorced from our history. I think in this millennia, we've seen rapid changes in the continent, right from emancipation, from countries that were under colonialism to greater regional integration. We've seen the Africa Union coming up that comprises of member states, coming up with charters that are focused around human rights, democracy, governance, and rule of law that actually are the bedrock of business. We've seen also an end to years of unconstitutional change of governments. Coups are really a thing of the past. We've seen periodic elections that are happening now. And even with those advancements, I think the challenges have really not changed since independence. It's often been around disease, poverty, and illiteracy, but also to some extent, Africa has never been telling its story. And so there has to be a way that Africa begins to talk about its own narratives and therefore describes itself through its own eyes so that it can better express the challenges but also opportunities for business and trade. I think it has to be known that Africa is not a country. It's home to 4 countries of different races and tribes. The continent is full of diverse people, but also opportunity around natural resources, but also human capacity, both around entrepreneurship, but also the entrepreneurial spirit that keeps on driving a continent that has a lot of these challenges. The continent, of course, like any other part of the world, has a vibrant geopolitical developments that often perhaps may challenge issues of sovereignty, but I think create a vibrant democracy. And with that, I think the continent is largely misunderstood, also because of complexity and of course, of the narrative around its history of exclusion, poverty, wars, and famine. And therefore, we have to understand the continent based on these eyes of whether it's colonialism or the risks that are around its burden of history, but also know that these risks can be mitigated. Of course, Africa has a political union through the African Union and the African Union Commission. It has an agenda and a 50-year agenda that is under the Agenda 2063. Under this, we see an architecture that facilitates trade through either free movement of people or for the first time, a continental free trade agreement. We're also seeing that perhaps a business opportunity is that Africa still has the youngest population. Its median age is about 19.5, who are digital natives, therefore, and only understand the world of digital. The continent hosts about 16 out of 26 fastest growing economies. The population is expected to reach to about 2.3 billion, which is an almost automatic market by 2050. 830 of the 2.3 billion would be young people. And so we see that as a large opportunity. Africa also has the largest growing digital consumer markets, where countries like Ghana and Kenya are experiencing almost over 100% of mobile telephony penetration. When you talk about risks, and we see in the media issues around terrorism like Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, or Al-Qaeda, these challenges are not uniquely to Africa. We see that even in Europe, because terrorism really is now a global challenge. But I think we increasingly are seeing collaboration between Africa and other parts of the world to stem this challenge. And trade could be one of those opportunities, because the more people understand each other, then the more we also begin to share and mitigate common risks. Beyond managing security risks, Africans themselves are beginning to understand that open government and government that is driven by being open, transparent, and accountable to citizens is actually a large factor in mitigating potential upheavals within citizens. African countries are part of the Open Government Partnership. We're seeing them signing up to beneficial ownership that makes transparent people who own companies, and therefore proceeds of corruption are more clearly tracked. We are seeing a framework of collaboration on repatriation of assets of corruption, whether between countries like the UK, Jersey, or Switzerland. We are seeing strengthening of norms around open contracting, where each company then can have a fair shot around contracts because those processes are increasingly becoming open. We are seeing an increase in separation of powers and lack of, or sort of less interference of the executive in the judiciary or the legislative process, so which means arbitration around business and trade issues are fair. When we look at digital trends, we're seeing a large potential of growth. Mobiles are growing by 5.2%. Internet penetration is about 8.7% annually. Young people are increasingly using social. We are seeing a large percentage of population, about 80% of the entire population right now is on mobile. And so this simply gives you a sort of a sense of where we are at, especially around digital and trade, because this is where really the fourth industrial revolution will be. Governments are largely investing in infrastructure. We're seeing undersea cables mushrooming around the continent. We're seeing a terrestrial backbone that is run by private sector, which is always exciting because it means there's some resiliency around it. There's one now that is running from Cape to Cairo. We are seeing more connectivity around, especially on fiber, to homes, which means access of more content streaming services, but also an infrastructure for online work. We are seeing a licensed spectrum that prepares Africa for the fourth industrial revolution. And most also, we are seeing young people, millennials, adopting to different ways that they work, mushrooming of co-working spaces. We are seeing reduction and improvement of ease of doing business, where companies can register as in less than 24 hours in some countries like Rwanda. We are seeing laws that enable repatriation of resources. We're seeing laws that enable people to work across borders and fair tax regimes. To sort of give a sort of an example around that is that increasingly We have African companies now, even countries sponsoring teams like the Premier League. Things like Arsenal, Hull City, or Southampton are sponsored by African companies or clubs. Formula One, which is not even Africa does not even have a single Formula One track, but because of this vibrancy, we are seeing sponsorship from Africa to these races. We're seeing an increase, for example, in disruptions around Fintech, and Fintech, which is a backbone of trade and finance, where mobile money has become the mode of trade and transaction. For example, in January in Kenya alone, we saw about 620 million being borrowed in a month through mobile money, disrupting the whole ecosystem around banking and finance. And I think for me, in closing, I'd like to look at this in sort of 5 key buckets. I think the first thing is, how do we continue to foster and promote policy innovation so that we continue to attract investments and facilitate trade without harming trade, especially in the era of the fourth industrial revolution, and because things are changing and moving very fast. The issue of data is, how do we keep on sharing data so that Africans are aware of what is happening in Europe and the US, and also, and likewise, that companies in the US are more aware, almost in near real time, what is happening in Africa, and mitigate and manage risks. How do we ensure that we have a co-creation so that we're not building for Africa, but we are building together products that are responsive to the markets and needs of both our continents? Is how do we continue to embrace a digital revolution, because our continent is increasingly young. And so how do we more or less look at modernization and providing services that are more responsive rather than trying to westernize and create a new culture? And lastly, I think is simply the whole notion of a design mindset and patient capital. Africa is still struggling from a burden of history. And so how do we create things that are good enough and not necessarily perfect, but also how do we fail fast, learn fast, and continuously ideate around our trade and investments?
Thank you so much, Philip, for your presentation. That was outstanding. And wonder if you might take a minute to tell us a little bit about Thunderbird's global strategy, and their strategy particularly as it relates to Africa. And then subsequent to that, maybe what you see their role in this digital revolution.
So the Thunderbird School for Global Management is a leader in the fourth industrial revolution. And as I've mentioned, Africa really is that space where this evolution is causing more disruptions. And therefore the school has a global hub strategy. It has hubs in Dubai, Geneva, Tokyo, and increasingly now set up a hub in Nairobi, Kenya, that wants to have a critical outlook around how Thunderbird School brings its offerings, one around executive education, because leaders of industry and government need to understand the fourth industrial revolution, plan and resource it. Online education, a larger population is young. I've mentioned the connectivity that the continent has. I've mentioned the reach and scale of the internet, and therefore online education becomes a mode of learning as people work, because that's the culture in Africa. Thunderbird also brings in the notion of thought leadership, where we must continue to create leadership, especially around policy innovations, even as technology changes within this revolution. And so Thunderbird becomes that school and partner, basically, to enable African leaders, governments, innovators, continue to remain on top of a revolution that is changing very fast. And so if we look larger across our hub strategy, it's simply being rooted in this reality, and therefore building as we go, building as we fly, because the revolution really requires all of us to be present. It requires all of us to co-create and contextualize a lot of the knowledge and content from Thunderbird, but fitting that within the context and wisdom of executives, students, innovators in the region.
Thank you so much. We'll turn the time over to Dr. Adolaru on the disastrous impacts of the status quo on the U.S. economy.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lee, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to be part of this discussion on the disastrous impact of the status quo on the U.S. economy. And the presentation will first introduce the status quo, and the second point in the outline, we'll discuss what makes Africa an attractive investment destination for the US. And the last presentation will basically provide a few recommendations that will help smoothing and sharpen the investment and trade relations between the US and Africa. So with the first slide, which is basically telling us what the trend and the status quo is. The status quo is not really very impressive. If I may tell you that, it's not very encouraging. What we observe is that, of course, historically, US and Africa, they've both been very wonderful trade partners and investment partners, and it's been rising over time, especially even with AGOA, with various trade programs put in place between the US and Africa. But you realize that over time, this has actually reduced because of the involvement of other foreign traders, foreign partners of Africa, like Asian countries, like China, like European countries, like even the EU. They've come to compete with the US in terms of the trade opportunities that exist within the global ecosystem. So, for example, if you take China as an example, its trade with Africa in 2015 was about $102 billion compared to the US, which was $17.8 billion. So that means that the Chinese trade is almost more than 8 times that of US. So this has disastrous implication for the US as a country, as its economy, and the US capacity to create jobs and create wealth from the relations and investment relations is got with Africa. Because our goal as an expert on US-Africa trade relations is for both the US and Africa to create wealth, create jobs, and help to enhance capacities of both economies to create more wealth. So why should the US increase or up his game in terms of his trade and investment relations with Africa? Is because, number one, Africa is one of the best investment destinations in the world, and that's why China is taking advantage of this. That's for another presentation. The African space in terms of the marketplace has so much opportunities across all sectors. In terms of the growth prospects, Africa has 10 of the fastest growing economies in the world, in which if you invest $1 million or even $100,000, you get the returns is the highest in the world. So the population in Africa is also quite huge in terms of providing markets for a growing economy. Also, in terms of the youth population, Africa has the most useful population in the world. In terms of arable land, arable resources, we've got it in order to feed the world. Of course, the technology may not be there, and that also helps to say a lot about where the US could invest in order to make more investment and create more jobs for the US economy. So the next slide presents the McKinsey's report, some of the findings from the McKinsey's report on the amount of money that could be generated in Africa between 2015 and 2025. And that's 5.6 trillion. Imagine $5.6 trillion in terms of business opportunities that exist across all sectors that the US businesses and the US government could leverage upon in order to harness these resources and harness these business opportunities to help create jobs, not only for the US, also for Africa, and also to take advantage of the 2.1 trillion household consumption that will exist in the year 2025. Also added to this is the ongoing continental free trade agreement in Africa that is going to create a regional market in Africa, which will be the biggest in the world, which would be an amount of $3 trillion. That will be the biggest of its kind in terms of market opportunity in the world. So in the next slide, which is to wrap up this presentation and discussion, is to give us some key strategic areas where the US could help enhance its game in terms of changing the status quo. And the first one is taking advantage of the digital transformation in Africa, the ICT sector, where currently there's increasing ownership of mobile phones, increasing ownership of programs that will help to transform the digital landscape in Africa. Trade facilitation, currently, there's still low capacity in terms of facilitating trade and reducing the number of days when goods are imported or when business policies are facilitated. These are areas where the US businesses could invest in logistics that will help make enough returns, considerable returns on their investment. The power sector, the US currently have Power Africa initiative in terms of creating opportunities for electricity in Africa. Other areas include the AGOA, the investment and trade agreement to be reviewed and revised, in addition to the Prosper Africa strategies that the current US government has put in place. And lastly is the agricultural value chain in Africa. They're still very, very weak. The actors, the capacities within the value chains, be it any agricultural commodity, they're still very weak. So for US business to come and invest in this sector is going to get good returns for money. And I would like to even point out that in Kenya, the recent studies show that the US has been relegated to the top place in terms of the largest foreign investor for the Kenyan economy, because it's been taken over by South Africa. Because so much opportunities in Kenya, in emerging economies in Africa, that we want the US to take opportunities of and how to change the status quo that we've got right now. Thank you for this opportunity, Lee.
Thank you, Dr. Odolaru. Just
you.
wanted to ask you if there's any last comments that you'd like to make and feelings about U.S.-Africa trade investment.
Thank you, Lee. I think the last comment I would love to make is there's increasing trade discussion regarding Africa as an investment destination in Africa. The US government is aware of this. Africa is aware of this, and everybody is putting all hands on deck, including CCA, including the Chamber of Commerce in the US and various African countries, including the African Business Portal, to create the enabling ecosystem that will help US to invest in Africa, help to change the status quo, and like recently in Nigeria, the embassy is putting in place programs that will provide business to business discussion and platform that will help businesses in the US to come to Africa, that will help our businesses and partners in Africa to discuss and have good business discussions with our businesses in the US. So we want more of this, and I think more of this will help to change the status quo and even help other non-US trading partners of Africa, maybe in Asia or EU, to learn how to trade with Africa. Because the good thing about the US in terms of its trade relations with Africa is that the US is providing the best practice in terms of how to trade all over the world, which I love so much, which I want other Asian countries, European countries, South American countries to learn from what the US is doing. But we want the US to do more. We don't want the US to relent in its efforts and feel that maybe another country has taken over Africa. No, we want more US investment, putting in place the right policy framework for other countries to learn from. And that would be a wonderful way to change the status quo.
Thank you so much, Dr. Odolaru. That was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
We're so grateful to have you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lee.
At this time, we'd like to turn time over to Quintin Skulls, Vice President and Partner of Africa Business Portal. He's also former Director of Forbes Africa and CNBC Africa. He'll be discussing a vision of economic change for U.S. and African SMEs. Turn the time to you, Quintin.
Thank you, Lee, and wonderful to be part of today's webinar. So let's take a snapshot look at the African marketplace. And the first thing that sticks out is that the total population sits at 1.3 billion. But the most important thing to understand is that this population will be doubling within the next 30 years. The biggest impact across the African marketplace, in our opinion, is the growth of SMEs. And if we look at South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya, just as a few benchmarks, that have well over 30 million SMEs in the formal sector. Some of the biggest changes that have occurred in the last year on the USA side is a commitment to Africa. And this came in the form of the Prosper Africa and the Build Act. So if we look quickly at the Build Act, we'll see that it's really focused on making equity investments and debt investments, providing technical assistance, but also the increased ability to take smarter risks. And it's been well claimed that the Build Act is not the only or a sufficient enough response to tackle the stronghold that other countries have already gained on the African continent. The Prosper Africa was driven by Ambassador Bolton, and in his own words, we have prioritized developing this document because we understand that lasting stability, prosperity, and independence and security on the African continent are in the national security interest of the United States. And this really is to advance both US trade, but to utilize the US dollars not only for aid, but to use that effectively and efficiently. The African Business Portal itself really is about engagement by connecting people, connecting project opportunities, really focusing on African-related education, virtual event support, connecting sub-portal networks, linking investors, and also linking promotional agencies. In terms of our anticipated growth and timelines, we've already started and commenced working with the DEC, which is the US District Export Councils, the Kenyan Private Sector Alliance, which has well over 500,000 members, the US Commercial Service, the Kenyan Council of Governors, which really have been focused largely now on project showcasing across their 47 counties, the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industries with over 4,000 accredited members. We've been working closely with the Thunderbird School of Global Management, which have an alumni of over 45,000. The African Diaspora Alliance, who are based out in Silicon Valley in the USA, and really denoting the strength of the diaspora's influence on foreign direct investments in Africa. The East African Chamber of Commerce, based out in Texas, and many other supporting organizations. We anticipate bringing on thousands of African members and over 700 projects by August of this year. And we've invited North American SMEs and investor groups, and which will be activating in September. In the up and coming weeks, we'll be expecting various other announcements from chambers of commerce associations across countries like Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, South Africa, Ethiopia. How are we going to go about doing that? Well, we have set up a very strong in-country leadership team. So our country managers range from myself, covering the Southern African market, but also across Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, Angola, Ethiopia, Cote d'Ivoire, and Uganda, and looking to develop that further as we extend our footprint. So the portal really can be seen as an umbrella online site which will allow various other associations, chambers, to showcase their countries or associations under the umbrella of the African Business Portal. And the uniqueness of this is that it gives you and gives them the ability to have full admin controls, database management, private and public communication, threads, amongst many others. And more importantly, that the members themselves have the ability to showcase projects, posting articles, listing of jobs, listing of events, and access to similar kind of related educational webinars like today. We have a vision to have millions of problem solvers, particularly with the focus on SMEs, thousands of project opportunities, which everyone can access no matter where they are in the world, and millions of potential partners and investors across the US and Africa. I think that brings me to the end.
Yes, I'm grateful to have you here, and thank you to each of you who participated in the webinar today, both the presenters and those who have participated. We'll have a short question and answer now, and you will be sending a email to clarify any issues you may have concerning the webinar and give you webinar support.